If you're not pointing the demand engine into the right direction, it doesn't matter how well you're doing campaigns, how much money you're investing into paid programs. If you have the best tech stack in the world, you're not going to see the results that you expect.
Anadelia Fadeev is VP of Demand Generation at HiveMQ, an industrial AI platform serving manufacturing, energy, and transportation companies. Before this, she led demand gen at 4 other B2B companies and now also scouts deals for Cowboy Ventures. Today, we're talking about the specific moment when scrappy demand gen tactics stop working and what it actually takes to build pipeline systems that scale past 10 million in ARR, including the capabilities that most leaders overlook and the one scrappy tactic that teams cling to for way too long. This is Are You Getting More? Anadelia, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
So you've been in demand gen leadership roles at 5 different B2B companies now, from Lightstep through to HiveMQ. What's the pattern that you've noticed in what founders get wrong about when to professionalize their demand gen function?
That's a really good question, and it's a tough question to answer when you are in it. I think oftentimes we see that you start a lot of your marketing and a lot of your demand gen with experimentation. Let's see what works. Let's try this. Should we build a community? Should we go to events? Should we do more digital? And you start finding that some of those things start working. And the excitement builds up and you just sort of want to do more, right? But I think the important piece to actually build something that scales is to understand what exactly is working and how do you recreate that? How do you build that into a scalable program? Sometimes people like to call that random acts of marketing, right? You're doing a little bit of everything, seeing what works. And I think that the key is understanding once you start seeing those patterns, how do you trace that back to the original thing that worked and then do more?
So from what I'm hearing, a lot of trial and error. Between your time at Teleport and now your time at HiveMQ, where you're selling into industrial manufacturing and energy, you've navigated pretty different buyer landscapes. How did that shift change your thinking about what actually creates pipeline momentum?
Across my my career, I've worked with many ICPs. I've actually also marketed to sales teams, IT, engineering, and now, as you mentioned, the industrial side. And the reality is each persona learns and evaluates things differently. And I think the key here is to understand, how do these personas go out there? What problems are they having? How do they find information that helps them solve those problems? And in which communities do they spend time in? Who do they trust to get some of that feedback? And then finding ways of joining those conversations in a way that comes in natural.
You're scouting deals for Cowboy Ventures and you're running demand gen at HiveMQ. And before we even got on this call, we had a conversation about, is demand gen part of sales? And I personally think that it is. When you are evaluating a Series A company's go-to-market motion, what's the signal that tells you that their pipeline generation will or will not scale?
That is a great question. I mentioned experimentation earlier, and I think that's critical for early stage companies, right? You've got to start with the, what we call the non-scalable things, right? Let's try to see what messaging might capture our audience, what channels are the ones that we find the most successful, and I think the key here is to identify those and double down on those, right? And I think that teams that are looking at the data to understand, hey, like, we've done 5 different things. We're seeing some results, but can you trace that back to what is the actual activity that led to that spike in growth, right? And is that a trend that we're seeing over time, or is that a moment in time, right? So I think digging into the data, for me, whether it's founders or early marketing hires, is looking at people that are curious about diving into the data to really understand what is driving the desired outcomes, and can we recreate that in a scalable way?
I like your approach to experimentation and data. I am a huge fan of, like, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it.
Yes.
And being able to see into those things and ask those curious questions is fantastic.
You should see the amount of spreadsheets that I have going. And that's actually something that as teams grow and become really more of a predictable demand gen engine, you kind of don't go away from the spreadsheets. Like there's always room for, continuing to dive into the data to really truly understand how your business is evolving over time.
Awesome. You talk about helping teams move from scrappy to scalable. What's the most common scrappy tactic that you see people actually cling to for too long? And how do you know when it's time to actually kill it?
I'm trying to think of a couple of examples. I mean, I think one thing that brings teams a lot of joy is events. In-person events is something that every company that I've worked with has experimented with. And the reality is, especially in a world where we're always in front of our computers, getting that face-to-face, in-person experience really makes a big difference in building relationships and building trust. But oftentimes what I've seen is the excitement from being at the trade show, being at the event, and having those face-to-face conversations is so great that teams want to keep doing that, right? But I think the important part here is to make sure that you have a really good end-to-end process. And I've seen many companies that have invested heavily into events, but don't really have a strategy for how do we make the most out of it before we even show up to the conference, and after we're done with the event, how do we make sure that we continue those conversations, right? That we have a good follow-up process, that we give a customized experience to every person that we spoke to at the booth, right? That we're maximizing the partnerships that we may have to make sure that we have a cohesive story between us and the other vendors that were there, right? Or that we are, maybe showcasing some of our kind of point of view or some of our customer successes and wins by getting on stage and sharing those stories. So events are an exciting one, again, because it brings that face-to-face, in-person interaction. But I think it really needs to be thought of as an end-to-end process. And so I'd say that's the one that I see teams often miss out on some opportunities to maximize the investment from.
HiveMQ is selling an industrial AI platform into verticals like manufacturing and energy, which aren't exactly early adopters of new technology or new software categories. How do you approach demand generation when you're simultaneously trying to educate a market that may not even know that they have the problem that you are trying to solve?
That's the reality of many companies, right? And I think when you're working with a market that's this complex, education is first, right? Education creates demand later on. But I think the key here is to understand, are the buyers able to name the problem that they have? I think when you're marketing to a market like this that's sort of complex, or it's solving complex problems, the key is education first, right? And that is what drives demand. Understanding, can your buyers name the problem they're experiencing? Where is this in the maturity level? Oftentimes that means, from the marketing side of things, you're producing a lot of content, right? And you're producing content that's not pitching your product, but you're producing content that is helping your buyers understand the complexities that companies in their space are going through. And what better way to do that than actually sharing real customer examples, right? So that's working with customers that are already in your space, that are already tackling some of those complex problems, and helping them share how they approach those problems with the rest of the world. And whether that's building blog series, workshops, I mentioned events earlier, and I think that's a good one too, right? Is you go to an event to learn how others are tackling those problems. So it really is about building credibility by sharing your customer stories rather than going straight into the sell. Because ultimately you want to build trust. You want to show that these are things that are approachable, and that companies that are experiencing that can see that there's a path on how to solve those. And even sometimes that means making introductions to, or building a community around companies in that same space so they can talk to each other, learn from each other. Ultimately, that kind of leads back to your product and how you can help solve some of those problems.
Absolutely, 100% agree. You mentioned bringing clarity to growing teams as part of your operating philosophy. What does that actually look like in practice? What's a specific example of where lack of clarity killed pipeline at a previous company?
For teams to scale, clarity is critical, right? And that is understanding your ICPs. Who is your audience? I can't tell you how many times I've talked to teams that just, they're so focused on the day-to-day that it's sort of hard to zoom back and think about who who are we actually talking to? Who is this product for? And so understanding your ICPs, who they are, what problems are they having? How does your product can help them solve those problems? Where are they spending time and where do they go to gain knowledge about how to solve those problems? Who do they trust to get advice on how to tackle those, right? Like that's step one. I think step two is really understanding your funnel. At what stage are you engaging with your potential buyers, right? Again, we were talking earlier about complex markets and complex problems, and oftentimes you meet buyers very early in their journeys, right? So maybe they're in the education phase. So that means your funnel starts at the education. You spend a lot of time educating the market, educating potential buyers on how to potentially tackle those problems. How do buyers make decisions as they go from learn to try to buy? Understanding all the components of that funnel is critical. And then the third one that brings clarity is metrics, right? Is understanding how do you actually measure each points of those of that funnel, and setting a baseline to understand what good conversion look like, right? If you're engaging a lot of people with educational content, but you're not really seeing the pipeline, that something is off in your funnel. And so ICPs, funnel, metrics are the three key things that will bring clarity to teams. And then clear ownership, right? Mm. What part of the funnel do you own as someone that works in demand gen? What are the KPIs that you're measuring to make sure that things are progressing the way that they should? Those are important things for teams that are in the day-to-day to make sure that what they're doing is actually having an impact.
Looking back at your head of marketing role at Byteboard, which only lasted 7 months, what did that specific experience teach you about either the role, the company stage, or your own preferences that ultimately changed how you evaluate opportunities?
Though short-lived, it was a great experience for me. The majority of my career I've spent at companies from Series A all the way through unicorn status, but really on the revenue side, it would be from 4 to about 30 plus million ARR, right? And so my focus has been solely on demand gen, and that's where I thrive, and I feel like I bring a lot of value into organizations. Byteboard was my first seed stage company, and so I was excited about the opportunity to come in very early and really be the first marketer building the foundation. What I ended up learning is that there's quite a bit that needs to happen before we actually start applying kind of demand gen into a lot of that early work really is to build out the understanding of our ICPs, understanding of our messaging and positioning, right? Not only who are we speaking to, who have we sold to in the past, and who do we want to sell to in the future based on what problems we're solving, but also how do we fit into this ecosystem where there's various other solutions and vendors that are maybe selling similar or adjacent technologies. That work is critical to be able to put together a path for demand gen to be successful, right? We need to understand what is it that we're solving, who are we solving this for, why us and not the competitors. I actually learned that it's there's a lot of skills that are required in that early phase that are not in my skill set. And so it definitely brought me a lot of clarity and a lot of hands-on experience in building ICPs, in talking to personas, but it also helped me realize that I, in fact, don't have some of the skills that are needed to actually go in and build the messaging and the positioning. If I had advice for anyone that is in demand gen and that's curious about going into a much earlier stage company, I think it's a well worth experience because it really helps you key into the areas that are, what I would call your superpower. And then get experience and gain hands-on experience in areas that you might not have otherwise.
It sounds like it was both informative for your own career progression as well as informative for how you approach the companies that you're talking to, the companies where you work, the companies that you advise. It just sounds like you were really able to take that and make it a holistic experience that was ultimately very positive.
Yes.
Well, I think you kind of already answered part of my next question, but I'll ask it anyway. If you were advising a demand gen leader at a Series B company right now who's getting pressure to scale pipeline fast, what's the one capability or investment you'd tell them to prioritize that most people overlook?
I would go back to do we have clarity on the three key areas, right? Do we know who our ICPs are? The answer might be yes, but I think I would go one level down and say, do we have that documented somewhere? Do we have that built into our processes, right? So that in everyone else on the team speaking the same language, is this something that when sales is outbounding, they're going after the same personas, that when marketing is evaluating, sponsoring an event or digital campaigns, that we're going after the same? If the answer is yes, and that's clearly documented in communicated across the entire go-to-market team, then I would move to the funnel. Do we understand what our go-to-market motion is? Are we mostly sales-led or product-led or some type of hybrid? And do we know our funnel stages and conversions? Do we have our metrics? So what I'm trying to say is, I think the basics is something that's a bit easy to overlook when you are thinking about what's next. And I would just go back to the basics. If we have clarity on those, then let's build on top of it.
The better that you get at building demand gen systems, the more clearly you can see what's still not working optimally. It's almost like an onion. Like, you solve this and it just reveals what the next challenge is or the next obstacle that needs to be overcome. So now that you've built out the foundational programs at HiveMQ, what's the constraint that you're currently most focused on eliminating? The one thing that would meaningfully accelerate pipeline if you could unlock it?
In the first year of my time at HiveMQ, I really focused on building the foundation, really just kind of the basics of making sure that we have an understanding of marketing to sales handoff, of the metrics that we measure, all of that good stuff. The second year was really focused on, now that we're scaling, how do we think about things like ABM, right? Account-based marketing is a program that many companies adopt that is essential for growing within a specific set of accounts, whether it's there's on a specific vertical or whatnot. And it helps us also build out our outbound motion, right? So we've got a good inbound funnel going. Let's focus on outbound. I think we're entering the third phase now, where we are looking at where AI can bring in some optimizations, right? And I think this is an area that can be quite overwhelming and noisy because there's so much going on out there. But for us, that means today identifying what are the various tools and that exist today that can help us improve our funnel efficiencies, right? Can we get a better understanding of how a nurture program can lead to someone from education to ready to, to try our product faster than we've experienced before. And so right now, that's the stage where I'm in, is looking at where can we bring in AI to bring us to bring some funnel efficiencies. And part of that is really just sifting through the noise, right? Because you're sort of looking at all the content that's out there, and trying to understand, what's real versus what is future looking, how are other teams and other companies applying those things today. But I think that's the next one. And I think with that, it also brings this idea of a hyper-personalized experience for the buyer, right? Up until now, I think most companies have been doing some form of segmentation, right? Like you talk to 100 people, half of them might be early stage in their journey, so you want to send them some education content. The other half may look like some of your existing customers, so you may want to focus on sharing some of those customer stories, right? With AI, we can be even more personalized.
Wonderful. Looking across everything you've learned from building demand gen at 5 companies and evaluating countless others as a venture scout, what's the one principle about generating B2B pipeline that you keep coming back to?
I really think that the most critical aspect is understanding your buyers or your ICPs, right? I think that's anything you build on top of that. If you're not pointing the demand engine into the right direction, it doesn't matter how well you're doing campaigns, how much money you're investing into paid programs. If you have the best tech stack in the world, if you're not pointing it into the right direction, you're not going to see the results that you expect, right? So I think it really is understanding who you're talking to, understanding your ICPs, and within that is what problems do they have? How do you solve that for them? And then in what way can you have a meaningful conversation with them?
Anadelia, thank you so much for being a guest on our show. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
If any of you watching or listening want to connect with her and see what they're doing over at HiveMQ, we'll put a link in the video description. Thank you so much for listening to Are You Getting More? We'll see you next time.